Welcome to the Greenfield Report with Henry R. Greenfield, your gateway to understanding today's geopolitical landscape. With 50 years of experience across 10 countries, Henry shares expert insights on world affairs, offering practical solutions and engaging guest perspectives. Dive into the Greenfield Report for lively discussions on the issues that matter.
This is Henry R. Greenfield for the Greenfield Report. Today, we are pleased once again to be meeting, this time in person, with Marc Finaud in Geneva, Switzerland. You may recall Marc has 36 years in diplomatic missions for France in several countries. And what were those, Marc?
Well, Soviet Union, Poland, Madrid, Vienna, Geneva, Israel, Australia.
And also, for the past 20 years, Marc has been here in Switzerland, focusing on nuclear disarmament, which is what we spoke about in our previous episodes. Today, we are asking Marc to return to his core roots or competency with a question that is becoming increasingly important, and one which, frankly, no one thought was possible until Trump returned with his second administration and turned the United States decidedly away from traditional American values in global leadership. While this has somewhat shocked the world, none more so than in Europe, where Trump and his team, including Vice President Vance, Defense Secretary Hegseth, and others, who have directly attacked Europe, calling them, among other things, freeloaders, and threatening to not provide the U.S. nuclear guarantee or honoring Article 5 of NATO, which is to come to the aid of any member. And there are 32, just to remind you, which has served as a deterrent, especially for Soviet and now Russian aggression. Along with this change has come a realignment between Trump and the United States working closely with Putin and Russia. So much so that last week, Putin has now effectively said that the U.S. could have Greenland if he could have Ukraine. This type of imperial politics has been unknown for the past 80 years when the United States adopted the doctrine of rules-based law, meaning no country can attack and take territory from any other country. This worked very well for democracy and the breakup of the Soviet Union and its satellites, many of whom became free and also joined NATO and the EU. With the U.S. all but abandoning Europe and now partnering with Russia, Europe is now left with many challenges. While defense has been the immediate concern, which we spoke about with Marc in previous episodes of the Greenfield Report, we would like to expand this conversation to a topic that perhaps should be the real opportunity for Europe. Okay, Marc, that was a rather long introduction, but we'd like you now to answer this ultimate question, which most people feel is the one that is facing the democratic world today. Can Europe begin to take over the global leadership of democratic nations as the United States withdraws and aligns itself somewhat, at least, with autocratic rulers such as Putin? And secondly, if you could take this as two parts, is it even appropriate to ask this question?
Well, of course, it depends on what kind of Europe you're talking about. Of course, if we think about the European Union, it started, as you remember, gradually as a peace project because to reconcile France and Germany, who had gone to war 3 times in a century. And the way to build this new alliance was to get the economies integrated. And therefore, there would be no chance that one country could build up its industry like Hitler did to have enough armament to invade the whole of Europe. And then, of course, it was based on common democratic values, the rule of law, democratic elections, etc. And it gradually expanded to include former autocracies, dictatorships, Spain, Portugal, Greece, and that, of course, reinforced this democratic character. It even became even more so when it attracted and integrated the former members of the Soviet bloc. including former Soviet republics like the Baltic states, and former members of the Warsaw Pact like Poland, Czech Republic, Slovakia, Hungary, Romania, etc. And obviously, for those countries, I mean, this opened a new era because those countries had been suffering, decades of dictatorship, monopoly of the Communist Party, etc. So they really wanted to consider Europe as a form of a beacon or a fortress to protect these freedoms. At the same time, when they enjoyed also the economic benefits of joining the EU.
So Marc, let me just interrupt and ask you a question. So we know that the EU was originally for economic purposes. We understand that, and it has expanded to a more democratic, broader-based mission. So today, which one is more important in your view, or do they run in parallel? Is it the democratic side? Is it the economic side? And we don't want to move off to defense, which is what we talked about last time, but also now the defense side.
No, obviously everything is interrelated because you can't really have a strong democratic system unless you have enough resources and benefits for the whole population. And that's why European countries have often been called welfare states, because they were built based on these systems of distribution of resources through taxation, sometimes very high levels of taxation like in the Scandinavian countries. But the result was a fairly stable system, of course, with ups and downs, with, as globalization came about, they of course, they were more vulnerable to economic crises happening elsewhere in the world. But altogether, it was because of this economic benefits and these resources that they could maintain a stable and democratic system. Now, as we know, of course, in recent years, we've had waves of populism towards the right, which may question these very values. But apart from the UK, which withdrew from the EU, not because of democracy, but out of maybe selfishness to protect their own resources, and they didn't want to share with the rest of the EU. There's not been any country that really realized that it would be better off outside the EU. Now, also, I think it's important to keep in mind, because it's not always very well known outside diplomatic circles, that the EU happens to be a united, integrated entity, not only from the economic point of view, but also politically, diplomatically. Ask any diplomat working either within the EU or sort of being an observer at the UN, you realize that this is a force. This is a force that attracts other countries. And systematically, when you have a proposal from the EU or the members of the EU, immediately you see a whole group of other countries outside the EU supporting it, co-signing it. And therefore, that shows that the EU still has this attractive power.
So that's very interesting, because I hadn't thought about it in that side. So it starts off as a stable entity that has gradually over time developed into more of a unified voice and democratic norms, and they have spread that throughout the EU. We also know that in many cases, even some countries such as Hungary, as an example, feels punished when they are not acting democratically enough. I think that the EU also has a lot of regulations in order and benchmarks to meet before you can become a member. And those are not only economic, but also on the democracy side. So I want to take a step back. So that's great. We've now established the stability of the continent under the leadership of the EU, although there's also countries outside of that now, but are still participating, such as the UK in its NATO membership, as well as other economic ties. There's even, by the way, when you talk about NATO, as you know, they've extended that olive branch to Canada. In Canada, using its French connection, Mark Carney, the new prime minister, actually made his first overseas visit to France, noticing that Canada feels more comfortable now as it is under threat from the United States. So we can begin to see that there is leadership potential for Europe beyond just the democratic side. But taking a step back here, looking at your diplomatic and your historical kind of perspective, are we in a new era of imperialism in your estimation? In other words, a breakdown of that so-called rules-based law? Or is this an aberration that is just Trump?
Well, I would say that if you look at the longer period, the longer term, obviously, there's always been periods when you had wars and conflicts motivated by imperialism or colonialism, and of course, the Europeans were part of that. And now, of course, since the end of the Cold War, there was this idea pushed by the conservatives in the United States, Reagan to start with, saying we won the Cold War, but the lessons learned from that, I think gave rise to a sort of triumphalism, a form of arrogance that had some impact also on Russia. You may remember when Clinton was making fun of Yeltsin because he was drunk, and all this, I'm sure affected the collective mind of the Russians, who had lost, in a sense, their empire, and then Putin tried to restore this empire. That's why he became so powerful and popular in Russia. So there's always been these trends, this great power competition and rivalries, except that Europe was part of the so-called free world. It had inherited this phrase from the Cold War. And now the new situation with Trump is that not only this close alliance is being questioned, but you see even threats from the big ally to the less powerful allies, Denmark, Canada, Panama was not ally, but was also in the sphere of influence of the US. But anyway, so this is what makes the situation new, and that leads to this sort of perhaps knee-jerk reaction from the Europeans now, that perhaps would need to be more thoughtful or discussed.
So Mark, as you know, and historically, Europe has had several of these kind of iterations to counteract imperialism, and then later became a large imperialist themselves. There has been such things as a Council of Europe, led by French diplomats such as Talleyrand in the 19th century. There have been other efforts that have been led by the League of Nations. And then, of course, as you just pointed out, the United Nations, where the EU often acts as a bloc. So not to bring in these kind of multilateral institutions, but is there a role with the EU? Because they have 2 seats on the Security Council. Is there a role for the EU to try to reshape the United Nations into something where the EU could have a more powerful voice, or is there another way?
Well, obviously, the world has changed since the 19th century, when the Concert of Europe, the Vienna Congress, decided to establish some form of security regime based on key principles such as respect for sovereignty, respect for territorial integrity, but also protection of political status quo. And this was a reaction to the Napoleonic Wars, of course. And then, of course, as you said, there was this new attempt on a multilateral framework basis with the League of Nations that couldn't prevent the Second World War, and then the UN. And at the same time, what happened was also decolonization. And, the world of 1945, and especially after the 1960s, was a completely different world as compared to the pre-Second World War. And this is where Europe, in a sense, lost its relative power. And now it's even more so, because if you compare the population of Europe, like less than 500 million, it is still the most wealthy group of countries. In a sense, it has this power, including military power, but compared to the other big nations or regions like Africa and Asia and China, India, it is much, much smaller. However, now, especially when you look at the BRICS as a sort of new attempt to create a new multipolar order to counterbalance the US-led order, again, you can see that most of the countries members of that group are autocracies, or I would say semi-democracies, like India, which is probably in that group probably the most democratic member. But Argentina had joined, but look at what's happening now.
So Marc, not to interrupt, but that's a really great point. BRICS, I view, and a lot of people do view it as autocracies that seem to have a revolving door with governments that come and go, and sometimes they're left and sometimes they're right. However, again, going back to this key core point, which is, does the EU have some special role to play? You also mentioned about the decolonization. There is, of course, I believe that Donald Trump has essentially abandoned anything that is not of direct interest for the United States in his so-called Fortress America, meaning he wants resources. Okay, he's a little interested in some of that, possibly in Africa, but otherwise, no interest. He has no interest in vaccinations, no interest in any of the programs to help Africa. France is also withdrawing from Africa, not to put the EU into the role of actually protecting the rest of the world. But the question that we have today is, does the EU have the values that the United States says that they have, but no longer is practicing them? And can the EU fill that gap?
Yeah, to a certain extent, yes, because the EU has been like the largest donor of assistance, development aid, including to the Palestinians. But unfortunately, that didn't stop, the Israeli attacks. But potentially, it remains this group of countries that can improve the lives of other countries, and also something again that is often misunderstood or not well thought of, is the fact that the EU has been acting for the last few decades as a form of norm-setting model. This, of course, it starts with the interest of EU countries in terms of harmonizing norms for, fighting pollution, meeting the climate action requirements, and all that. And everybody benefits. Even Switzerland, which is not a member of the EU, which is surrounded by EU countries, can not afford to have special agreements with the EU to apply exactly the same norms, the same legislation. So in that sense, of course, it's difficult to apply the same norms across the world, across the globe, because it depends very much on the level of development of countries. But democratic norms remain part of this global picture, and again, they remain attractive when you have countries or empires breaking up, like former Yugoslavia, former Soviet Union, the first decision made is to apply to the EU, like Georgia is doing, Ukraine is doing, because they consider it again as the best model to protect their national rights and their economic benefits.
So that's a very interesting summary. Thank you for that. So if we looked at the EU, we can see, and by extension, we're going to put in the United Kingdom and even Canada when it comes to the defense side. But if you look at the EU, they have three pillars. One pillar is going to be, of course, the economic side. That was the original pillar. The second one is the democratic values side, which you are pointing out. They have now exported that successfully to a number of countries that did not have that as their tradition, and it's working quite well. And then the third is, of course, now the defense side, which the EU is looking at providing defense separate from NATO while still using possibly the nuclear umbrella of the United States. So if you looked at that as kind of a package, should the EU be going out to the world with that in a kind of a complete, let's say, suite of objectives, or is it too much and should they be just taking this piece by piece?
Well, again, history shows that Europeans have always been motivated throughout crises. A crisis can boost a decision for more unity, stepping up the cooperation, etc. And let's not forget that the EU, and again, it's not easy to understand. It's like a strange beast. There are actually two EUs. There's the EU based on cooperation among independent states, and that is the case for security and defense and a few other issues like migration, energy, etc. And the EU as a single organization where the states have delegated their powers, sometimes very extensive powers from their sovereignty to a joint organization run by the European Commission. And that means that in those areas like trade and customs, it's not up to the states to decide, it's up to the Commission, of course, under the control of the European Parliament, which is the democratic dimension of the EU. And of course, it's dependent on the available resources provided by the member states. Now, in defense, as I said, it's really based on cooperation. Now, the EU is sort of trying to instrumentalize the current crisis to extend its powers. And this is being discussed. It's not, final. So they look at it from the angle of the defense industry, which is I would say, a sort of legitimate topic for the EU as such, as a joint institution. Now, obviously, in the current crisis, there is this decision because of this fear of threat perception from Russia, to increase military budgets, to increase defense projects, etc. The problem is that we inherited a long-term system which was based on mutual assistance, mutual cooperation within NATO, where the US, of course, would guarantee, thanks to its military power, security and defense on the NATO members, and most NATO members agreed to buy American weapons. Basically, this was the deal, the bargain, and therefore, it's now when you hear Trump saying, the Europeans need to spend more, that means they need to buy more American weapons, and Trump doesn't even understand how NATO operates. It's not a big organization like the UN that has peacekeeping forces. No, the organization itself has a very limited budget, less than $5 billion. That is half the UN budget, including peacekeeping operations. But the rest means it's up to the member states to put eventually some of their forces at the disposal of the organization in case they will be needed, like there were French forces sent to Afghanistan to support the US after 9/11. And this is how NATO operates. So the EU obviously cannot operate the same way, and it will be dependent more on national decisions to increase defense spending and equipment. But the key now, considering the reluctance of Trump to support the Europeans, will be to build up a more autonomous European defense, which will require cooperation between those countries within the EU that have an advanced defense industry, like France, Germany, Italy, Spain, Sweden, etc.
Well, Marc, thanks again for that detailed explanation. I think it's also important for us to note that something did happen today. Marine Le Pen was convicted in France, and she will not be able to run for office for at least 5 years. What that means is that she cannot run for office in 2027. Now, that's when the French presidential campaign will be. The point here, I think, I would like to make is that Europe's response to somebody that has now been convicted of a criminal offense was unlike that in the United States. And it was also both cases, hers was financial, as well as the Trump was related to finance and, of course, falsifying records. So there is a difference here in the term of the rule of law inside the EU, which seems to be making a stricter interpretation than the United States. In other words, a divergence away from the US approach to democracy. So if we can just kind of summarize this up, it seems to me that the EU, you would agree, but I don't want to put words in your mouth, that the EU has a special place for them to be in now on a global basis, for the EU to start stepping in as actually a place where multiple nations can work together. And as you say, they have their own government. It's not just economic. It's not just defense. It's also a cooperative government where they have ceded some of their rights, significant rights, to the EU so that they can actually have a more productive relationship. So is it true then, in your view, that the EU, and by extension, even these other parts, could be UK and Canada, can begin to step into that, what a lot of people feel is a vacuum being left by Trump and the move to the right in the United States?
I mean, certainly Europe has the capacity, has the resources to do it. I'm not sure they have the same determination or same, decisiveness in all European governments. There are differences of approaches, but at the same time, I think it would be careless to rush into unwise decisions or decisions that would, because of their impact, would need a thorough discussion, thorough reflection, work with experts, etc. For instance, we talk about Russian threats. This is something that certainly needs to be analyzed seriously. And then there are also other avenues. Diplomacy has always been one way of approaching international relations, including to prevent conflict or to solve conflict. And this is certainly what the EU should continue to do, which doesn't exclude, of course, beefing up its defense. But at the same time, it would certainly be better for everyone and certainly cheaper to find new solutions, a new order. And for the security order in Europe, there were many missed opportunities. I remember during the Cold War when we were negotiating with the Soviets about human rights and human contacts and freedoms. And of course, they were in the defensive. But whatever we managed to achieve was very useful for their population to seek, to claim new rights and eventually to overthrow the system. Now, today, I think we should also out of a position of strength and unity, negotiate better solutions with, of course, specific means of verification. Why not also in deploying UN peacekeeping forces, like in border areas in Ukraine or other countries, and because the EU cannot exist in a vacuum. It is part of a wider community and has to find sustainable solutions. No leader is eternal. Even if Marine Le Pen had been elected president, she would have been there for a term, maybe two. But again, we should look at things in a longer perspective and avoid hasty decisions that we may regret if there is a change of leadership.
Well, I think that brings us full circle, Marc, that hasty decisions seem to be the order of the day for Trump. And the EU, as you are pointing out, is a group, a body that is more deliberative, that is more step-by-step, that is also one that requires verification. And I think all of these are attributes that are going to work well in the future. At the moment, however, we have a very different situation. We have a very transactional, as they talk about it for Trump, transactional approach, which I don't think works extremely well with the EU because they are the opposite in terms of how they make their decisions. So if we can conclude, Marc, by saying this, and you can tell me if I'm right or wrong, the EU does offer a different model than the way that the United States seems to be going. However, do you believe, and this is, I'm going to put you on the spot, will the EU model of deliberation, verification, security guarantees on a collective basis in the long run be more successful, or will this go it alone approach of both Putin as well as Trump be the way that the world is going to move over the next 1 or 2 decades?
But again, in the longer term, I think that this is the only solution which would be realistic and sustainable. We know that all dictatorships, all empires one day collapse. And so this is something that, the hope that can motivate us. And we should do everything possible to allow people to claim their rights, exert their freedoms, and question sometimes these authoritarian regimes. And again, the EU has the longest and the most successful experience in integrating different countries with different histories that used to be at war with each other, but it's not the only one. On the European continent, you still have neutral countries. Some are members of the EU, some are not, like Switzerland. But you have economic organizations like the Free Trade Agreement. You have also the Council of Europe, which is a wider organization with most European countries, and Russia was expelled because it, didn't apply its commitments in terms of human rights. And even more recently, President Macron initiated a new approach, which is very flexible. It's not an organization for European political cooperation or community, meaning, again, there will be probably a very loose secretariat, very loose organization, but the idea is to integrate countries on the continent that are members of different organizations. That includes, of course, UK, Turkey, Switzerland, Norway, etc. And this is this again was prompted by the aggression against Ukraine, and it's like a new wake-up call that Europe needs to get its act together and push this peace project, this peace model, at the same time with, of course, also beefing up its own defense.
Well, thank you, Marc. I think that's a great place for us to end this discussion. I'm sure we'll be having Marc back again with us in the future. Today, what we have been discussing is the diplomatic side of what's going on in Europe vis-a-vis the United States, and the United States taking much more of a singular role away from being an ally and moving more towards a one-on-one negotiations with Putin and Russia. While the EU, you can see from Marc's discussion, it is a very much a collective group, a group that has ceded some of its own autonomy in order for the better good of all of the members. And that includes on the diplomatic side, it includes on the economic side, and of course also on the defense side. So we'd like to thank Marc for this discussion today, which I believe moved the needle forward on what is the future role of Europe. Thanks again, Marc.
Thank you.
This is Henry R. Greenfield reporting from Geneva, Switzerland for the Greenfield Report.
Thank you for joining us on the Greenfield Report with Henry R. Greenfield. We hope today's insights into the ever-shifting geopolitical landscape have sparked your curiosity and broadened your perspective. Stay connected with us for more in-depth discussions and expert solutions. Until next time, keep exploring the world beyond the headlines.